3,600,000 years ago, during the fading warmth of the Pliocene epoch, the global ocean was a realm of unimaginable giants. Beneath the sunlit turquoise surface of the shallow coastal seas, a shadow the size of a modern commercial aircraft glided with silent, terrifying grace. The creature did not simply swim, it seemed to command the very water to part before it. This was Megalodon, the supreme apex predator of its era, a marvel of evolutionary engineering that represented the absolute pinnacle of predatory design. Measuring a staggering 20 meters from the tip of its blunt, sensory-rich snout to the trailing edge of its massive crescent-shaped tail fin and weighing upwards of 50 tons, it was a biological dreadnought. Its lineage had been refining the dark art of the hunt for over 20 million years, passing down the genetic blueprints of survival through eons of changing tides and shifting continents. This was not a mindless eating machine, but a sophisticated, warm-blooded navigator of the deep, possessing a cartilaginous skeleton that provided unparalleled flexibility for its immense bulk, and a massive liver filled with squalene oil that granted it perfect, effortless buoyancy in the water column. The physical presence of such an animal defies our modern comprehension. To look upon it would be to witness the absolute limit of what flesh and bone can achieve in a marine environment. The sensory world of this leviathan was a symphony of invisible signals. Along its snout were thousands of tiny gel-filled pores known as the ampullae of Lorenzini, an intricate biological network capable of detecting the microscopic electrical fields generated by the beating hearts and contracting muscles of its prey from astonishing distances. Down the length of its slate-gray flanks ran the lateral line, a hydrodynamic sensory organ that felt the faintest pressure waves and low-frequency vibrations, allowing the giant to literally feel the struggles of a wounded whale miles away. Its olfactory bulbs were enormous, highly developed command centers that could process the scent of blood diluted to just a few parts per billion in the vast oceanic expanse. When it hunted, it utilized a jaw spanning nearly 3 meters across, lined with 276 serrated triangular teeth, some measuring over 18 centimeters in length, roughly the size of an adult human hand. These weapons were not designed for holding, but for devastating, catastrophic trauma. With a bite force estimated at a staggering 108,000 newtons, it possessed the most powerful bite of any known creature in the history of the planet. It targeted the rib cages of small baleen whales, deliberately crushing their hearts and lungs in a single, devastating impact, a strategy of overwhelming shock and awe that ensured a swift, decisive end to the struggle. Yet, for all its unparalleled power and evolutionary perfection, the giant was fundamentally tethered to the fragile geological stability of its world. 3,600,000 years ago, the Earth was a dynamic, restless entity, its tectonic plates constantly grinding and drifting in a slow-motion dance driven by the chaotic convection currents of the molten mantle deep beneath the crust. For tens of millions of years, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans had flowed freely into one another through a wide, deep channel known as the Central American Seaway. This massive exchange of warm equatorial water acted as a planetary thermostat, distributing heat globally and sustaining the rich, shallow coastal nurseries where the young megalodons could grow in safety, shielded from the cannibalistic tendencies of adults and other oceanic threats. But the continents were moving. The South American plate drifted slowly, inexorably northward, colliding with the Caribbean plate. Massive volcanic activity began to build a chain of islands, which eventually fused together to form an impenetrable barrier. the Isthmus of Panama. The closing of this vital oceanic gateway severed the ancient connection between the great oceans, fundamentally and permanently altering the global thermohaline circulation. The warm equatorial waters were suddenly deflected northward, creating the Gulf Stream, which carried immense amounts of moisture up toward the Arctic. This redirected moisture fell as endless snow across the northern latitudes, building massive continental ice sheets that reflected the sun's warmth back into space, initiating a brutal planetary cooling cycle. The Earth plunged into the Pleistocene epoch, the era of the ice ages. As the glaciers locked up millions of cubic kilometers of the planet's water, global sea levels plummeted by dozens of meters. The warm, shallow coastal seas that had served as the crucial nurseries for the Megalodon pups suddenly vanished, exposing vast tracts of dry continental shelf. Simultaneously, the cooling oceans triggered a radical shift in the marine ecosystem. The small baleen whales, the primary food source for the giant sharks, evolved to survive in the frigid, newly productive polar waters, growing massive layers of blubber and increasing in size to become the giants we know today, such as the blue and fin whales. Megalodon, despite being a regional endotherm capable of keeping its body temperature slightly warmer than the surrounding water, was ultimately a creature of the warm seas. It could not follow its prey into the freezing polar extremes. Starved of its primary food source, deprived of its vital nurseries, and suddenly facing fierce competition from the newly evolved, highly intelligent, pack-hunting ancestors of the killer whale, the greatest shark to ever exist simply faded into the dark abyss of extinction. That is the history written in the fossil record, reconstructed from countless enormous teeth scattered across the ocean floors and embedded in sedimentary rocks. For centuries, these triangular stones confused human observers. In ancient Rome, the philosopher Pliny the Elder recorded the belief that these objects fell from the sky during lunar eclipses. Throughout the Middle Ages, they were collected as tongue stones, widely believed to be the petrified tongues of dragons or giant serpents, prized by nobility, who dipped them into wine to neutralize poisons. It was not until the year 1667 that a Danish anatomist named Nicholas Steno dissected the head of a great white shark caught off the coast of Italy and recognized the undeniable anatomical similarities. Steno made the profound deductive leap that the tongue stones were the fossilized teeth of ancient, impossibly large sharks, laying the groundwork for the entire science of paleontology. More than a century later, in 1835, the Swiss naturalist Louis Agassiz finally bestowed upon the creature its scientific name, Otodus megalodon, meaning simply big tooth. Through the work of these scientists, the extinction became an accepted fact of natural history. But tonight, we are going to imagine a vastly different reality. We are going to ask a profound question. What would have happened if that geological event, that slow collision of tectonic plates, had played out differently? The movement of the Earth's crust is not predestined fate. It is a chaotic system of contingencies driven by microscopic variations in mantle viscosity. Some geologists have modeled scenarios where the Central American Seaway never fully closed. If the volcanic archipelago had remained fractured by deep channels of rushing water, the catastrophic disruption of the global ocean currents would never have occurred. The Atlantic and Pacific would have continued their eternal exchange of warmth. The Pleistocene glaciation would have been averted entirely. The oceans would have remained a global hothouse. The shallow coastal nurseries would never have drained away. The baleen whales would not have been forced to flee to freezing polar extremes. the giant would have continued its ancient reign as the master of the marine world. So, take a moment to adjust your surroundings. Dim the lights if you have not already done so. Allow the frantic pace of the terrestrial world to fade away. Take a deep, slow breath, feeling the air fill your lungs, and imagine the rhythmic, eternal push and pull of a warm tide. Listen for the deep vibrations of a world preparing to continue rather than end. Let go of your certainties about what is, and open your mind to the oceanic expanse of what could have been. We are about to embark on a journey through millions of years of evolutionary history that never happened, charting the course of an empire that was never overthrown. The waters are warm, the shadows are deep, and the giant is still swimming. Let us explore this alternative reality together. 2,500,000 years ago, the world did not freeze. In our established historical reality, this precise epoch marked the bitter onset of the Pleistocene, a relentless, punishing cycle of encroaching ice and retreating seas that fundamentally reshaped the architecture of planetary life and drove countless magnificent species into the dark void of extinction. But, in the alternative timeline we are exploring tonight, the tectonic plates beneath the ocean floor traced a subtly different path. The Isthmus of Panama never fully materialized as an impenetrable continental bridge. Instead, it remained a scattered volcanic archipelago, heavily fractured by deep turbulent channels of rushing water. Because of this geological contingency, the Great Equatorial Current, a colossal invisible river within the ocean carrying unimaginable volumes of accumulated solar heat, continued its eternal, unobstructed journey from the Atlantic directly into the Pacific. This continuous, unbroken flow prevented the catastrophic rerouting of warm water to the extreme northern latitudes. The Gulf Stream, the powerful oceanic engine of the northern ice ages in our timeline, was never born in its modern devastating form. Consequently, the heavy, moisture-laden clouds that would have buried the northern continents beneath kilometers of crushing glacial ice simply never gathered. The global climate remained firmly trapped in the humid, bountiful, sweltering embrace of the Pliocene hothouse. Because the vast continental ice sheets of North America and Eurasia never formed, the global sea levels did not plummet. Instead, they remained high and extraordinarily stable, surging dozens of meters above the coastlines that we recognize today. Vast, fertile portions of what we now know as the state of Florida, the sprawling coastal plains of the Americas, the lowlands of Europe, and the archipelagos of Southeast Asia remained completely submerged beneath shallow, sun-drenched emerald seas. These sprawling, nutrient-rich continental shelves were the absolute key to the survival of the giant shark. They were the nurseries. In our world, the catastrophic disappearance of these shallow seas forced the young of Otodus Megalodon out into the harsh, unforgiving open ocean, exposing them to starvation and unprecedented predation before they could reach their massive adult proportions. In our alternative world, these vital sanctuaries not only persisted but expanded. The young giants, born alive at a length of roughly 2 to 3 meters, dropped from the massive wombs of their colossal mothers into a vibrant, sheltered paradise, teeming with small, slow-moving prey and complex labyrinthine reef systems. These intricate coastal environments offered perfect sanctuary from the cannibalistic hunger of the adult megalodons, who were generally too massive to navigate the shallowest lagoons. Here, in the warm, sunlit shallows, the young apex predators had the time and the absolute abundance of food required to grow, slowly packing on tons of muscle and cartilage over decades, protected by the geographical stability of a world that refused to change. Evolution is frequently misunderstood by the human mind as a relentless ladder of constant change, a chaotic drive to constantly become something new. But when an organism achieves a state of near-perfect biological synergy with a stable environment, natural selection acts not as an engine of change, but as a heavy, immovable anchor. This phenomenon, known as stabilizing selection, would have defined the existence of the Megalodon in this alternative warm world. The giant shark did not need to evolve into something else, because its environment was not asking it new questions. It was already the perfect absolute answer to the question of how to dominate a warm, shallow, cetacean-rich ocean. Its anatomical design, refined over 20 million years, was held in a state of terrifying perfection. Its cartilaginous skeleton, far lighter and infinitely more flexible than the solid bone of marine mammals, allowed it to accelerate its 50-ton bulk with an explosive, terrifying kinetic energy. Its cardiovascular system was a marvel of biological engineering, featuring a complex network of blood vessels called the retia mirabilia, which acted as a countercurrent heat exchange system. This allowed the Megalodon to retain the metabolic heat generated by its massive swimming muscles, keeping its core temperature several degrees warmer than the surrounding water. This regional endothermy granted it the explosive muscle power and rapid neurological processing speed of a warm-blooded predator, combined with the extreme metabolic efficiency of a shark. It was a thermodynamic masterpiece, operating at peak efficiency in the unbroken summer of the Pliocene. To understand the continuation of this empire, we must look at the foundation upon which it was built: the prey. In our timeline, the onset of the ice ages forced the ocean's productivity to shift radically toward the freezing poles. To survive, the ancient baleen whales had to adapt, migrating vast distances to feed on the seasonal explosions of krill in the icy waters, and fasting for months as they returned to warm waters to breed. This grueling migratory lifestyle strongly favored gigantism, driving the evolution of the massive bluefin and humpback whales we know today. Creatures so large they eventually outgrew the predatory capacity of even the Megalodon. But in our alternative timeline, without the ice ages, the oceans remained uniformly warm and highly productive in the equatorial and temperate zones. The whales did not need to undertake massive, exhausting migrations, and therefore they were not subjected to the intense selective pressures that drive extreme gigantism. The oceans remained dominated by the Cetatheriidae, a diverse family of small to medium-sized baleen whales, typically measuring between 4 and 10 meters in length. These creatures were abundant, relatively slow swimming, and bred continuously in the warm, stable seas. For the Megalodon, a Cetather was the absolute perfect package of energy, large enough to provide a massive caloric return, but small enough to be killed efficiently with a single catastrophic bite to the thoracic cavity. The relationship between the giant shark and the small whales was not one of impending extermination, but of a brutal, perfectly balanced ecological equilibrium. The Megalodon populations were naturally limited by the sheer territorial requirements of such massive predators, and their slow reproductive rates, with females likely taking decades to reach sexual maturity, prevented them from exhausting their food supply. The ocean was a vast, finely tuned machine of life and death, running smoothly on the limitless energy of the sun. But the giant shark was not the only sovereign in these waters. In the deeper pelagic zones beyond the continental shelves, another magnificent lineage of predators was evolving alongside the megalodons. These were the macroraptorial sperm whales, creatures like Livyatan melvillae, which possessed skulls 3 meters long and enormous, conical teeth that interlocked like the gears of a terrible machine. Unlike modern sperm whales, which dive deep to hunt soft-bodied squid, these ancient leviathans hunted other whales near the surface. In our timeline, the climatic chaos of the Pleistocene drove them to extinction alongside the Megalodon. In our alternative timeline, they persisted, establishing a tense, violent ecological partition with the giant sharks. The megalodons ruled the warm, productive continental shelves and the coastal migratory routes, while the giant, pack-hunting raptorial sperm whales likely dominated the deeper open ocean expanses. Imagine, for a moment, the sensory reality of this alternative ocean, perhaps 1 million years ago. A massive female megalodon, spanning nearly 18 meters and bearing the deep white scars of decades of violent encounters, patrols the edge of a steep continental drop-off. The water is a luminous crystalline blue, maintaining a comfortable temperature of 24 degrees Celsius. Through her lateral line, she feels the rhythmic low-frequency pressure waves of a pod of small baleen whales several kilometers away, their tails beating in uncoordinated unison. She does not rush. She adjusts her pectoral fins, utilizing her immense squalene-filled liver to achieve perfect motionless buoyancy, and begins a slow, deliberate ascent from the darker depths. Her counter-shaded body, dark slate gray above, stark white below, renders her virtually invisible against the deep water as she approaches her prey from beneath. She relies on the element of absolute surprise, aiming to deliver a single fatal strike that will crush the rib cage and vital organs of her target before it can even register her presence. This is a scene of predatory execution that is played out millions of times over tens of millions of years, an unbroken chain of biological inevitability. There is a profound, almost unsettling peace to be found in contemplating this alternative reality. It represents a world that is not subjected to the constant, chaotic resets of catastrophic climate change. It is an Earth locked in a steady state of magnificent, terrifying biological abundance. The survival of the megalodon in this timeline is not a fairy tale of monsters, but a strict mathematical expression of ecological stability. When the environment does not break, the apex predators do not fall. They simply continue to reign, their genetic legacy passing from one generation to the next in an endless, violent, beautiful cycle of sustaining life through death. As we drift further into this exploration, we begin to realize that the extinction of the megalodon was not a failure of its biology, but a simple, tragic consequence of shifting continental plates. It was a victim of geography, not of evolution. And in understanding this, we can begin to untether our minds from the assumption that the history of our planet was the only history possible. The oceans are vast, the currents are deep, and the possibilities of what could have been are as infinite as the stars scattered across the silent night sky above the ancient rolling waves. 1,500,000 years ago, the global oceans of our established history were undergoing a profound and violent acoustic transformation. The creeping advance of the Pleistocene ice ages had fundamentally altered the thermal dynamics of the planet, creating stark freezing temperature gradients that churned the deep, nutrient-rich waters toward the surface in massive global upwelling events. This environmental chaos became a ruthless evolutionary crucible. To survive the unpredictable, rapidly changing conditions and the vast freezing distances between food sources, marine mammals were forced to adapt in a radical new direction. They became phenomenally intelligent. The ancestors of the modern killer whale, Orcanis orca, began to develop massively encephalized brains, complex social structures, sophisticated cooperative hunting strategies, and intricate vocal cultures that allowed them to pass down generational knowledge. Intelligence, in our timeline, was the ultimate weapon forged by a desperate freezing world, allowing warm-blooded mammals to usurp the apex predatory niches and establish an empire of the mind beneath the waves. But in the alternative timeline we are exploring tonight, the eternal Pliocene hothouse provided a continuous, unbroken environmental stability. And absolute ecological stability does not reward the high metabolic cost of a massive, pondering mammalian brain. Rather, it exclusively rewards extreme physical efficiency and raw anatomical perfection. To understand why the giant shark maintained its absolute dominion, we must deconstruct a deeply ingrained human bias. We inherently view intelligence, self-awareness, and complex problem-solving as the ultimate inevitable goals of the evolutionary process, simply because these are the specific traits that allowed our own species to conquer the terrestrial world. However, from a strictly biological perspective, a large mammalian brain is a staggering liability. It consumes over 20% of the body's total caloric energy intake just to maintain basic function. It requires an exceptionally long, highly vulnerable childhood to fully develop, and it demands constant, high-quality nutrition. In an environment that is shifting and unpredictable, this massive energetic gamble pays off by allowing the organism to invent new ways to survive. But in an ocean that has remained warm, highly productive, and fundamentally unchanged for tens of millions of years, there are no new problems to solve. The environment is asking the exact same questions it asked eons ago. For the Megalodon, a creature that had already achieved the perfect physical answer to the challenge of hunting in warm, shallow seas, there was absolutely no selective pressure to become smarter. Its brain was relatively small compared to its massive 50-ton body, but it was not primitive. It was a hyper-specialized, brutally efficient sensory processor, dedicating vast tracts of neural real estate exclusively to the olfactory bulbs and the integration of signals from the lateral line system. Because the Megalodon and its fellow cartilaginous giants occupied the absolute pinnacle of the food web, with unassailable physical supremacy, the evolutionary trajectory of the oceanic dolphins and the ancestors of the killer whales was completely suppressed. In this alternative reality, the cetaceans that might have evolved into highly intelligent, pack-hunting apex predators were permanently relegated to the ecological margins. They remained small, fast, and relatively quiet, forced to specialize in hunting tiny schooling fish or squid deep in the pelagic zones where the giant sharks rarely ventured. They could never develop the slow-maturing, highly social cultures of our timeline, because the warm, shallow coastal waters, the very places where dolphin pods congregate to socialize, breed, and raise their vulnerable young in our world, were actively patrolled by the largest, most heavily armed predatory fish the planet had ever produced. Any aggregation of slow-moving, vocalizing mammals in the shallows would instantly attract the attention of a creature capable of detecting a heartbeat from kilometers away. The mammalian spark of high intelligence, which requires safety and time to cultivate, was continuously, mercilessly extinguished by the flawless mechanical perfection of the giant shark's instinctual design. This absence of complex marine mammalian societies completely altered the physical and auditory landscape of the global ocean. Without the massive global upwelling currents generated by the ice ages, the great kelp forests of our timeline, those towering underwater cathedrals of brown algae that thrive in cold, nutrient-dense waters, never spread across the continental margins. Instead, the oceans of this alternative Earth were highly stratified. The surface waters were incredibly warm, constantly heated by the unobstructed equatorial sun, while the deep abyssal plains remained cold and dark, with very little mixing between the layers. While this meant the open pelagic ocean was relatively nutrient-poor compared to our modern seas, the submerged coastal plains were an explosion of tropical biodiversity. Because the sea levels remained dozens of meters higher than our current coastlines, the warm, shallow waters covered immense tracts of continental crust, creating the perfect conditions for the greatest biological construction project in the history of the planet, the Great Pan-American Reef. Imagine a continuous, unbroken labyrinth of living coral stretching from the submerged, sun-drenched coastal plains of what would be modern-day Massachusetts, winding continuously through the flooded Caribbean basin and extending all the way down to the tropical shores of Argentina. This was not a mere string of isolated atolls, but a massive, three-dimensional limestone megacity, hundreds of kilometers wide in some places, plunging into sudden, dizzying drop-offs where the continental shelf gave way to the abyss. The water here was a blinding crystalline turquoise, maintaining a constant bath-warm temperature of nearly 30 degrees Celsius year-round. This sprawling, hyper-complex environment was the absolute epicenter of the Megalodon's empire. Navigating this intricate terrain required unparalleled sensory integration. The giant shark, gliding silently above the vibrant coral heads, utilized its thousands of ampullae of Lorenzini to read the minute bioelectric signatures of the countless organisms hiding within the calcium carbonate structures beneath it. It did not need to see its prey. It could feel the geometry of the living reef and the electrical pulse of every concealed creature, painting a perfectly accurate three-dimensional map of the environment directly into its predatory consciousness. The auditory reality of this world was vastly different from the ocean we know today. If you were to submerge yourself in our modern oceans, you might hear the haunting, highly structured, multi-layered songs of the humpback whales, or the incredibly loud, low-frequency pulses of the blue whales communicating across entire ocean basins, sounds that evolved specifically to traverse the vast, empty, freezing expanses created by the ice ages. But the ocean of the giant shark was devoid of these complex, melancholic ballads. Because the baleen whales of this timeline remained relatively small and highly localized within the rich, shallow reefs, they had no biological need to communicate across thousands of kilometers. Their vocalizations were brief, practical, and highly localized, simple clicks, soft grunts, and low moans designed for immediate short-range coordination. The true dominant sound of this alternative ocean was not a song, but a physical vibration. It was the deep, rhythmic, subsonic thrumming of a massive crescent-shaped tail fin sweeping back and forth, displacing tons of water with every stroke, a terrifying acoustic signature that silenced the reef long before the shadow of the giant ever passed overhead. There is a profound, liberating peace to be found in contemplating the absolute indifference of this alternative reality. It forces us to gently dismantle our deeply held anthropocentrism, the comforting but fundamentally flawed assumption that the universe was somehow waiting for us, that the cosmos actively desired the emergence of complex thought, philosophy, and technological civilization. The unbroken reign of the Megalodon proves, through the unyielding logic of evolutionary mechanics, that the planet requires absolutely no consciousness to be magnificent. It does not need a mind to observe it, to name its creatures, or to write poetry about the endless crashing of its waves. The giant shark was not a stepping stone on the path to something greater. It was the ultimate finalized expression of biological energy flowing through a stable marine environment. It was a masterpiece written in cartilage, muscle, and serrated enamel, entirely devoid of self-doubt, existential dread, or the painful burden of contemplating its own mortality. As the modern world outside your window continues its frantic, noisy, and endlessly complicated progression, allow yourself to sink into the deep, quiet rhythm of this ancient, unchanging ocean. Feel the slow, deliberate pulse of a world that simply exists exactly as it is, without the agonizing need to constantly become something else. The water is perfectly warm. The vast, living reef stretches out into the infinite blue. The giant shadow glides effortlessly through the sunlight, an eternal sentinel of a world that never shattered, a living testament to the serene, absolute perfection of a reality governed not by the restless anxieties of the mind, but by the quiet, undeniable gravity of the physical form. Let the heavy, crushing weight of human complexity dissolve into the simple rhythmic motion of the ancient tides. The ocean requires nothing of you. It simply endures. 500,000 years ago, the Earth continued its silent rotation through the vast, indifferent vacuum of space, harboring an oceanic empire that defied the very concept of epochal change. In our recognized timeline, this specific moment marked the Middle Pleistocene, an era defined by brutal, oscillating extremes. Our hominid ancestors were frantically migrating across the freezing, drying landscapes of a violently unstable planet, utilizing primitive stone tools and the newly discovered magic of fire to stave off the encroaching cold. Their existence was a desperate, shivering struggle against a world that was actively trying to kill them. But in our alternative reality, the great continental ice sheets still refused to materialize. The Isthmus of Panama remained a scattered, fractured archipelago. The global ocean currents continued to circulate warm equatorial waters seamlessly around the globe, and because the environment remained locked in this sultry, magnificent equilibrium, the undisputed monarch of the seas, Autodus Megalodon, continued to reign with terrifying, majestic complacency. We must pause to comprehend the sheer magnitude of a species remaining at the absolute pinnacle of the food web for over 20 million years. Human civilization spans a mere 10,000 years. We view our brief technological ascent as the ultimate triumph, yet it is less than a microscopic fraction of the time this giant shark spent dictating the ecological terms of the global ocean. This was not merely an animal, it was a permanent, localized force of nature, as reliable and inevitable as the tides themselves. To fully appreciate the reality of this unbroken dominion, we must venture beyond the vibrant, sunlit shallows of the great Pan-American reef. We must travel out into the pelagic void, the vast, seemingly endless expanse of the deep ocean. Here, suspended in a boundless sphere of pure sapphire blue, swims an ancient matriarch. She is a staggering spectacle of biological engineering, measuring 22 meters from the tip of her scarred, sensory-rich snout to the trailing edge of her massive upper caudal lobe. She weighs an incomprehensible 70 tons. She has navigated these warm seas for nearly 80 years, outliving generations of smaller creatures that dart nervously from her colossal path. Her immense body is a living historical record of a violent, uncompromising world. Deep, jagged white scars crisscross her slate-gray flanks, the calcified remnants of territorial clashes with rival females decades ago, or the desperate strikes of massive raptorial sperm whales she has hunted and consumed. She is not simply an individual organism, she is a mobile, self-contained ecosystem. Thousands of specialized parasitic copepods cling securely to the trailing edges of her fins, while dozens of slender striped remoras surf the powerful hydrodynamic bow wave generated by her massive head, waiting to scavenge the scraps of her catastrophic kills. Her skin is an armor composed of millions of microscopic, tooth-like structures called dermal denticles, which channel the water perfectly along her body, eliminating turbulence and allowing this 70-ton behemoth to glide through the dense, heavy fluid with the silent, frictionless grace of a phantom. Despite her unimaginable bulk, she is not bound to the surface. As the equatorial sun reaches its zenith, driving the smaller, light-sensitive prey species deep into the cooler, darker layers of the water column, the matriarch decides to follow. She adjusts the angle of her massive, rigid pectoral fins, which span an incredible 6 meters from tip to tip, and begins a slow, deliberate descent into the twilight zone. Her physiological adaptations for this vertical journey are nothing short of miraculous. Unlike the massive marine mammals that must carry a finite supply of oxygen in their lungs, subjecting themselves to the crushing, agonizing pressure of the deep, her cartilaginous skeleton is fundamentally compressible. She has no air-filled cavities to be crushed. Her massive liver, filled with hundreds of liters of low-density squalene oil, compresses slightly under the mounting atmospheric pressure, allowing her to carefully control her buoyancy as she descends past 100 meters, then 200 meters, then 300 meters. The light from the surface slowly fades into a deep, haunting indigo, and the temperature of the water drops significantly. Yet, her complex network of specialized blood vessels aggressively conserves the metabolic heat generated by her slow, rhythmic tail strokes, keeping her massive brain and optic nerves perfectly warm and exquisitely sensitive in the encroaching gloom. In this dimly lit alien environment, her primary sensory apparatus transitions from vision to a profound three-dimensional tactile and electrical awareness. Through the thousands of ampullae of Lorenzini dotting her snout, she reads the microscopic bioelectric fields of the ocean, a glowing, invisible matrix of life. Suddenly, a massive, anomalous electrical disturbance registers in her primitive, fiercely efficient brain. It is the rhythmic, powerful heartbeat of a colossal creature, accompanied by the low-frequency pressure waves of a massive tail moving with deliberate, predatory intent. It is a descendant of Leviathan, a giant pack-hunting sperm whale, an apex predator in its own right, armed with massive interlocking teeth designed for tearing flesh. In our timeline, these magnificent creatures perished as the oceans cooled and their prey vanished. Here, they have thrived, locked in an eternal high-stakes evolutionary arms race with the giant shark. The matriarch does not accelerate into a mindless frenzy. She is a masterpiece of thermodynamic efficiency. She does not waste a single joule of energy unnecessarily. She carefully calculates the trajectory of the distant whale, utilizing her massive liver to achieve a state of perfect hovering neutrality in the water column, suspended in the absolute silence of the deep. She waits, a 70-ton shadow blending seamlessly into the dark indigo void, allowing the massive mammal to close the distance. When the strike finally occurs, it is an event of incomprehensible, devastating violence, executed in absolute silence. As the giant whale passes overhead, completely unaware of the monstrous presence lurking in the thermal gradient below, the matriarch unleashes the full, terrifying kinetic potential of her 70-ton body. Her massive tail sweeps back and forth with explosive, earth-shattering power, propelling her upward at a speed that defies physical logic. She hits the whale from below, her jaws opening to a maximum gape of nearly 3 meters. 276 serrated teeth, driven by a bite force exceeding 110,000 newtons, shear cleanly through the thick blubber, muscle, and solid bone of the whale's thoracic cavity. It is not a fight, it is an execution. The sheer hydrostatic shock of the impact instantly pulverizes the whale's vital organs. The enormous mammal dies instantly, its life extinguished in a microscopic fraction of a geological second, before its massive brain can even register the sensation of pain. A cloud of dark red blood billows out into the indigo water, rapidly expanding like a sinister, blooming flower. The matriarch violently thrashes her massive head from side to side, her serrated teeth sawing through the dense flesh, carving out a bite that weighs over 500 kilograms. She swallows it whole, her digestive acids already rushing to break down the massive influx of life-sustaining proteins and lipids. As she slowly circles the sinking, mutilated carcass of the Leviathan, securing her immense caloric prize, we are invited to reflect on the staggering, impersonal majesty of this alternative world. In this reality, the African savanna never dried out enough to force our primate ancestors out of the trees. The evolutionary pressures that would eventually forge the human mind, the desperate need for cooperation, complex language, and the creation of tools were never ignited. We simply do not exist. There is no human history. There are no pyramids, no wars, no philosophical treatises on the meaning of life, and no agonizing existential dread. The earth is entirely free from the burden of our restless, anxious, endlessly dissatisfied consciousness. And yet, the planet is not diminished by our absence. It is resplendent. It is a world of terrifying, magnificent perfection, governed solely by the elegant, unyielding laws of physics and biology. The giant shark does not wonder why it exists. It does not fear the future, and it does not regret the past. It simply swims, hunts, and survives, a perfect biological machine, operating in absolute harmony with a stable, ancient world. There is a profound, liberating comfort in this realization. It teaches us that the universe does not require a mind to be beautiful, that existence does not demand a narrative, and that life, in its most pure and unadulterated form, is simply the glorious, brutal, and eternal transfer of energy beneath the cold, silent stars. Allow the crushing weight of human importance to slip away from your shoulders. Let it sink into the dark, silent depths alongside the falling snow of organic matter. The world continues, grand and indifferent, and in that vast oceanic indifference, we can find a deep, enduring peace. 50,000 years ago, the terrestrial surface of our established history was a theater of desperate, scrambling hominid expansion. In the freezing, unforgiving shadow of the great northern glaciers, bands of anatomically modern humans were wrapped tightly in the stolen, blood-stained skins of Pleistocene megafauna, huddling around flickering, wind-whipped campfires and looking up at the merciless, icy stars with eyes full of terror and nascent wonder. They are painting the walls of deep, resonant limestone caves with the ochre and charcoal images of the giant beasts they hunted, driven by an emerging, profoundly anxious consciousness that desperately sought to impose meaning, narrative, and control upon a hostile, chaotic, and seemingly arbitrary world. But in the alternative timeline we are constructing and inhabiting tonight, there are absolutely no fires burning in the dark. The earth remains locked in its eternal, sweltering, magnificent Pliocene equilibrium. The vast, unbroken, humid forests of the continents hum with the steady, undisturbed rhythms of ancient, perfectly balanced ecosystems. Yet, the true majesty of this epic is not found on the static, unchanging landmasses, but in the boundless, circulating three-dimensional expanse of the global ocean. Because the Isthmus of Panama remained a fractured, porous archipelago of volcanic islands rather than a solid continental bridge, the colossal equatorial current, a thermal river of unimaginable power and volume, flowed continuously from east to west, wrapping the entire planet in a permanent, life-sustaining embrace. This unbroken hydrological superhighway created a world without oceanic borders, a contiguous, unified marine realm where the giant shark could express its absolute, unassailable dominance on a truly global scale. To comprehend exactly how Autodus Megalodon navigated this infinite, borderless blue void, we must fundamentally abandon our human reliance on visual landmarks and embrace the invisible electromagnetic architecture of the living planet. Deep within the massive cartilaginous skull of the giant shark, situated precisely between its enormous olfactory bulbs and its primitive but fiercely efficient forebrain, lay a cluster of highly specialized sensory cells packed with microscopic, perfectly formed crystals of biogenic magnetite. These iron-rich cellular structures acted as a profound internal compass, exquisitely sensitive to the subtle sweeping planetary lines of the Earth's magnetic field, which is generated by the chaotic churning of molten iron in the planet's outer core, thousands of kilometers below. This was not a vague, instinctual sense of direction, but a precise, three-dimensional, high-resolution internal global positioning system. When a 50-ton megalodon swam, it did not merely move through the fluid water. It physically felt the invisible magnetic grid of the planet pulling and pushing against its neurosensory network. It could detect the microscopic variations in magnetic inclination and intensity as it crossed submerged oceanic ridges, volcanic seamounts, and deep, lightless abyssal trenches. Coupled with the thousands of ampullae of Lorenzini distributed across its broad snout, which could read the faint electrical signatures generated by the conductive ocean currents physically moving through the Earth's magnetic field, the shark possessed a dynamic map of the world that was infinitely more accurate and reliable than any chart ever drawn by human hands. It knew its exact latitude, longitude, and orientation simply by existing quietly within the water column. Imagine a magnificent, fully mature male megalodon embarking on a trans-global migration during this era. He is a scarred, heavily muscled, terrifyingly perfect veteran of the warm Pacific Basin, measuring an astonishing 16 meters in length from his blunt snout to the tip of his towering dorsal fin, and weighing an incomprehensible 40 tons. He is driven not by conscious desire, but by ancient, irresistible hormonal imperatives to seek out new genetic lines and breeding grounds in the distant Atlantic Basin. In our accepted historical timeline, this transoceanic journey would be an absolute physical impossibility, abruptly blocked by the solid, impassable continental wall of Central America. But here, in this reality, he approaches a sprawling, chaotic matrix of lush volcanic islands and deep, rushing azure channels, the magnificent archipelago that never fused to become the country of Panama. The water rushing violently through these narrow straits is highly oxygenated, incredibly turbulent, and thick with the chaotic, overlapping electrical noise of millions of schooling fish, migrating sea turtles, and desperately fleeing marine mammals. He navigates the treacherous, shifting tidal currents with the effortless, instinctual, and terrifying grace of a creature whose lineage has mastered the intricate laws of fluid dynamics over tens of millions of years of rigorous evolutionary testing. He does not fight the rushing current. He utilizes his immense squalene-filled liver to achieve perfect buoyancy, and subtly adjusts the precise angle of his massive pectoral fins to ride the hydrodynamic pressure waves, slipping through the jagged continental fractures like a colossal slate-gray phantom. As he crosses the threshold from the Pacific into the warm, inviting waters of the Caribbean Sea, the subtle, mathematically precise shifts in the planetary magnetic inclination register instantly in his brain, quietly confirming his successful passage into a new, vast, and completely accessible ocean basin. Upon entering the Atlantic, the giant male encounters a familiar, yet subtly different biological landscape. The great Pan-American reef stretches out endlessly before him, a sprawling, hyper-complex limestone metropolis teeming with unique subspecies of small, fat baleen whales, giant, heavily armored sea turtles measuring over 4 meters across the carapace, and massive, slow-moving dugongs grazing on endless meadows of seagrass. The sheer, overwhelming abundance of life here is a direct, cascading consequence of the unbroken ocean currents, which continuously transport vital, life-sustaining nutrients from the deep Pacific upwelling zones directly into the shallow, sunlit Caribbean basin. The male megalodon does not hunt with the frantic, desperate energy of a starving animal. His massive metabolism, perfectly stabilized by the eternal, unbroken warmth of the tropical waters and the sheer density of available prey, operates at a state of calm, terrifying, and absolute efficiency. He selects his targets not out of malice, anger, or sport, but through a cold, unfeeling mathematical calculation of caloric expenditure versus caloric return. He patiently shadows a pod of small, unsuspecting dwarf sperm whales, utilizing his dark, counter-shaded dorsal surface to blend perfectly into the deep blue depths below them. He isolates a weakened, slightly slower individual with deliberate, calculated, and terrifyingly silent movements. The kill, when it finally comes, is a breathtaking masterpiece of kinetic physics. A sudden, explosive burst of muscular speed that culminates in a bite force capable of severing a solid steel beam. The impact is absolute, the energy transfer instantaneous and totally devastating. The ocean briefly clouds with a sudden burst of crimson, a momentary violent disturbance in the eternal serene blue, before the myriad scavengers arrive in a chaotic swarm to erase all physical evidence of the violent, perfectly natural transaction. As we follow this silent, majestic global migration across the ancient, undivided seas, we are profoundly confronted by the deeply alien reality of a world entirely devoid of human boundaries. We are a species absolutely obsessed with demarcation and division. We arrogantly draw imaginary invisible lines across continents. We claim absurd ownership of the shifting, untamable seas, and we build massive walls of stone and ideology to divide the fundamentally indivisible. We live our entire fleeting lives confined, stressed, and anxious within the rigid, artificial, and ultimately meaningless structures of our own restless minds. But the giant shark knows absolutely nothing of borders, nations, or territories. To the megalodon, the earth is a single, continuous, magnificent, and unbroken medium of existence. It does not recognize the concept of the Pacific or the Atlantic. It only recognizes the comforting, life-giving warmth of the thermal gradients and the guiding, invisible, and infallible hand of the planetary magnetic grid. There is a deep, resonant, and unimaginably profound freedom in this existence, a complete liberation from the heavy, suffocating, and exhausting constraints of the human condition. The giant shark does not worry about the anxieties of tomorrow, for it has absolutely no concept of the future. It does not carry the agonizing, paralyzing weight of the past. It exists entirely, beautifully, and perfectly within the absolute undivided present, suspended effortlessly in the warm, saltwater womb of an unchanging, indifferent, and magnificent planet. Allow yourself to gently let go of the imaginary lines you have drawn in your own life. The deadlines, the boundaries, the divisions between what was, what is, and what you fear will be. Imagine the sensation of water rushing smoothly and continuously over your skin, supporting your weight entirely, rendering you perfectly weightless in a vast, dark, and endless blue expanse. You are untethered from the rigid land. You are free from the burden of complex thought. You are simply drifting, guided by the slow, eternal magnetic pulse of the earth itself. The ocean is vast, the currents are warm, and there is nowhere else you need to be. The journey is endless, the destination is an illusion, and the deep silent waters offer nothing but perfect, absolute, and dreamless peace. 10,000 years ago, in the timeline that we stubbornly understand as the only true reality, the global climate finally began to stabilize after the brutal, chaotic, and violently oscillating fluctuations of the Pleistocene ice ages. The great crushing continental glaciers slowly retreated toward the poles, carving out the deep fertile valleys and vast freshwater lakes that define our modern terrestrial geography, and the Earth tentatively entered the Holocene epoch. On land, a fragile, hairless, uniquely anxious species of bipedal ape stood on the precipice of a monumental and irreversible transformation. They were just beginning to cautiously gather the primitive wild seeds of ancient grasses, constructing the very first permanent settlements from baked mud and rough-hewn stone, and forging the complex psychological foundations of agriculture, private property, and hierarchical civilization. In the fertile valleys of the Middle East, they were systematically domesticating wheat and meticulously observing the cyclical movements of the stars to accurately predict the life-saving seasonal rains. In a mere 10,000 years, an unimaginably brief fraction of planetary history, they would transition from hunting massive mammals with chipped flint spears to splitting the atom, decoding the genetic alphabet, and leaving mechanical footprints on the cold, silent surface of the moon. This frantic, explosive, and relentlessly upward trajectory is what we proudly, almost desperately, call progress. But in the alternative reality we are exploring tonight, where the Isthmus of Panama remained a fractured, porous archipelago, and the life-giving ocean currents never dramatically shifted their ancient paths, the human concept of progress is entirely, beautifully meaningless. There was absolutely no Holocene. There was no agricultural revolution. There were no nascent human civilizations gazing up at the night sky, crippled by existential dread, wondering what the unpredictable future might hold. There was only the eternal, unchanging, magnificent equilibrium of the Pliocene Ocean, a world governed by a colossal predator that had achieved absolute, unassailable biological perfection over 20 million years prior. To fully grasp the staggering, beautiful stagnation of this alternative world, we must closely examine the most fundamental engine of biological continuity, the act of reproduction. In the warm, shallow, sun-drenched waters of the fragmented Pan-American archipelago, an ancient, massively scarred female megalodon is preparing to give birth. She is a magnificent survivor, nearly 90 years old, a towering matriarch spanning an awe-inspiring 18 meters in length and weighing over 60 tons. She has traversed the boundless, borderless global oceans for nearly a century, consuming thousands of tons of cetacean flesh and enduring the violent, terrifying territorial clashes of the deep, lightless pelagic zones. Now, driven by an ancient, undeniable, and complex hormonal cascade, she has returned flawlessly to the precise geographical coordinates of her own birth, guided by the infallible magnetic map embedded deep within her neurochemistry. This shallow, complex, labyrinthine network of vibrant coral reefs and dense, submerged mangrove-like forests is inaccessible to the massive, aggressive, and highly cannibalistic males of her species, providing a vital temporary sanctuary for the continuation of her genetic legacy. The biological mechanics of her reproduction are a marvel of ruthless, hyper-efficient, and unsentimental evolutionary design. Unlike many thousands of species of teleost fish that broadcast millions of tiny, defenseless eggs into the open, chaotic water currents, leaving the survival of their offspring entirely to statistical chance and the whims of filter feeders, the Megalodon is oviviparous. Her offspring do not hatch in the vulnerable open ocean. They hatch internally, deep within the dark, protected confines of her massive, dual reproductive tracts. Inside the warm, highly oxygenated fluid of her enormous uterus, a brutal, microscopic battle for survival has been raging in complete darkness for many months. The female shark produced hundreds of eggs, but only a select genetically robust few were actually fertilized. As these primary embryos hatched from their soft, leathery egg cases within the womb, they were immediately faced with an environment of intense, zero-sum competition. To fuel their rapid, massive, and metabolically demanding growth, these unborn pups engaged in a highly specialized ancient form of intrauterine cannibalism known to science as oophagy. They systematically hunted, killed, and consumed the hundreds of unfertilized eggs continuously produced and delivered by their mother's ovaries, converting this extraordinarily rich, high-protein yolk directly into dense bone, flexible cartilage, and powerful, twitch-ready muscle fiber. By the time the massive matriarch finally initiates the physical act of parturition in the shallow tropical waters of the archipelago, the surviving pups are no longer fragile, defenseless infants relying on maternal protection. They are fully formed, heavily armed, apex predators in their own right, measuring nearly 3 meters in length and weighing hundreds of kilograms. As they slide smoothly from the massive cloaca of their mother into the bright, sunlit turquoise waters of the ancient reef, they do not require any maternal care, instruction, guidance, or protection. They are born utterly independent, instinctual, and devastatingly efficient killing machines, already possessing the perfect streamlined aerodynamic form, the rows of razor-sharp serrated teeth, and the highly advanced hypersensitive electromagnetic sensory systems that have guaranteed the survival of their lineage through countless eons of planetary history. The colossal female Megalodon does not linger in the shallows. She does not form an emotional bond with her offspring, nor does she offer any defense against the myriad dangers of the reef. The sheer, overwhelming metabolic cost of carrying and nourishing such massive predatory young has severely depleted her vast vital fat reserves, and the shallow, highly complex reef environment is physically claustrophobic and utterly unsuitable for a 60-ton behemoth requiring deep water to maneuver effectively. With a powerful, sweeping, and majestic thrust of her colossal crescent-shaped tail, she turns her scarred, sensory-rich snout back toward the deep pelagic blue, abandoning her young instantly to the ancient, uncompromising, and flawlessly fair laws of natural selection. For the newborn pups, however, the shallow coastal waters are an absolute, unparalleled paradise of biological abundance. Because the devastating ice ages never formed to drain these rich continental shelves, The coral reef systems are unimaginably vast, spreading out for thousands of uninterrupted kilometers. The warm waters are absolutely teeming with slow-moving sirenians, massive, heavily armored sea turtles, giant dugongs, and endless shimmering schools of smaller, energy-rich fish. The young megalodons will spend their first several crucial decades entirely within these warm, highly protected nurseries, hunting relentlessly, growing steadily, and packing on the multiple tons of dense muscular mass required to eventually leave the shallows and challenge the true giants of the deep open ocean. Their existence in this nursery is a perfect, enclosed, and beautifully simple loop of energy consumption and physical growth, entirely disconnected from any concept of technological or social change. They do not ever need to invent new, clever hunting strategies. They do not need to form complex political social alliances with their siblings, and they certainly do not need to pass down accumulated cultural knowledge to the next generation. Everything they could ever possibly need to know about how to dominate their incredibly complex environment is irrevocably hardwired directly into their flawless genetic code, a breathtaking sequence of instinctual, predatory algorithms perfected millions upon millions of years before the very first anxious hominid ever struggled to walk upright on the dry, dusty plains of the African continent. When we modern humans look back across the vast, dizzying, and almost incomprehensible expanse of deep geological time, we instinctively and unavoidably project our own deep-seated anxieties and psychological insecurities onto the natural world. We view the extinction of a species as a tragic moral failure, and we view rapid technological progress as the ultimate necessary and undeniable validation of a species' inherent worth in the universe. We are absolutely terrified of stagnation. We are terrified of remaining exactly the same because our entire brief evolutionary strategy is predicated on constant, frantic, and stressful adaptation to a rapidly shifting, hostile, and unpredictable world. We build, we invent, we conquer, and we destroy, entirely because we feel profoundly unsafe in the present moment. But the magnificent giant shark, swimming effortlessly through the warm, eternal, and unchanging waters of this alternative reality, completely and beautifully shatters this narrow anthropocentric paradigm. Stagnation, when it occurs within a perfectly stable, highly productive environment, is not an evolutionary failure. It is the ultimate, practically unattainable dream of biological existence. It is the absolute, unassailable summit of the evolutionary mountain. The giant shark is not waiting anxiously for a better tomorrow. It is not striving tirelessly for a higher state of philosophical consciousness or a deeper mathematical understanding of the cosmos. It does not look up at the cold, distant stars searching for meaning. It only feels the comforting, reliable, and invisible pulse of the Earth's magnetic field and the rhythmic, life-sustaining beating of its prey's heart in the water column. It is entirely, beautifully, and terrifyingly complete, exactly as it is. Imagine the profound, crushing, and overwhelmingly peaceful relief of existing in a world where absolutely nothing ever needs to be improved. Let the frantic, exhausting, and endless demands of human life, the constant grinding pressure to learn, to grow, to build, to change, to leave a lasting legacy before your brief time expires, dissolve completely into the warm, salty, ancient waters of the eternal reef. Imagine that you are suspended perfectly in that crystalline blue fluid, entirely weightless, supported flawlessly by the heavy density of the ocean. You are breathing slowly, evenly, and deeply, matching the ancient, unhurried rhythm of the eternal tides. There are absolutely no expectations placed upon you by the silent, indifferent universe. There is no looming, stressful future rushing aggressively toward you, demanding your immediate attention, your constant anxiety, and your endless physical labor. There is only the slow, perfectly balanced and endlessly repeating cycle of the ocean, the comforting, radiant warmth of the equatorial sun filtering down in shimmering golden rays through the blue water column, and the silent, majestic passage of a perfect creature that has elegantly solved the ultimate riddle of existence simply by refusing to alter its form. The uniquely human, culturally enforced obsession with constant, linear progress is merely a clear symptom of our deep existential discomfort in the cosmos. We build endless towering monuments and sprawling digital networks specifically because we feel that we do not truly belong to the natural order. But the giant shark belongs completely and unapologetically, seamlessly integrated into the very physical fabric of the planet itself. As you allow your mind to drift further down into the dark, comforting depths of pure relaxation, allow yourself to fully and completely embrace that magnificent, unthinking, and total belonging. Let go entirely of the desperate, exhausting need to constantly move forward into the unknown. Let the gentle, warm current safely take you, slow and steady, into the boundless, eternal, and perfectly peaceful present moment. The great ocean has always been here, waiting patiently. And in this quiet, unchanging, and beautiful world, it will remain forever and ever. 1,000 years ago, in the timeline that we desperately cling to as the only valid historical truth, the fragile, anxious species of terrestrial apes was rapidly expanding its chaotic influence across the treacherous, unpredictable surface of the global oceans. The ancestors of modern humanity were meticulously carving the trunks of massive trees to construct primitive wooden vessels, utilizing the terrifying, unpredictable power of the wind and the faint, shimmering light of the distant stars to navigate the vast, intimidating void of the sea. They stared out at the dark, rolling waves with a profound existential terror, populating the unknown depths with mythological sea monsters, leviathans, and malevolent deities, born entirely from the darkest, most insecure recesses of their own imaginations. They were terrified of what lurked beneath the surface because they were fundamentally terrestrial creatures, alienated and incredibly vulnerable in the aquatic realm. But in the alternative, magnificent reality we are traversing tonight, the surface of the ocean remains completely and beautifully undisturbed by the splashing oars and the panicked, shouting voices of exploring humans. The sea monsters of this world are not mythological constructs drawn on the fading edges of parchment maps. They are the absolute, undeniable, and mathematically perfect reality of the biological hierarchy. Yet, to truly understand the magnificent, self-sustaining architecture of this eternal Pliocene ocean that adamantly refused to freeze, we must temporarily look away from the warm, sunlit, vibrant hunting grounds of the continental shelves. We must follow the inevitable, heavy, and silent gravitational pull of mortality down into the crushing, eternal darkness of the abyssal plain. Even the most perfect, ruthlessly efficient biological machine ever engineered by the slow, grinding processes of natural selection must eventually succumb to the inescapable degradation of cellular senescence. Far out in the boundless pelagic void of the Pacific Basin, swimming hundreds of kilometers off the deeply submerged coast of the South American continent, an ancient, massively scarred male megalodon finally reaches the absolute conclusion of his extraordinary metabolic journey. He is over 120 years old. He measures 19 meters in length and weighs an incomprehensible 85 tons. For over a century, he has dominated this water column, consuming tens of thousands of tons of cetacean flesh and enforcing the brutal stabilizing equilibrium of the marine ecosystem. But now, his massive heart, a heavily muscled organ roughly the size of a small automobile, simply ceases its rhythmic, powerful contractions. He does not experience a moment of frantic existential terror. He does not possess the neurological capacity to mourn his own passing, nor does he fear the absolute nothingness that follows. He simply stops swimming, because his massive cartilaginous skeleton is exceptionally dense, and because his enormous specialized liver has finally depleted its vital buoyant reserves of low-density squalene oil during his final starving weeks of decline. His colossal 85-ton body begins a slow, silent, and incredibly majestic descent through the water column. The journey to the bottom of the abyssal plain is not swift. It takes many hours of steady, uninterrupted falling. He sinks gracefully past the epipelagic zone, leaving the warm, sun-drenched waters behind. He falls steadily through the mesopelagic twilight zone, where the faint scattering indigo light is finally and entirely swallowed by the absolute, freezing, and impenetrable darkness of the bathypelagic zone. The hydrostatic pressure increases exponentially with every single meter he falls, eventually reaching a staggering 40 megapascals. But there are no fragile, air-filled mammalian lungs to violently rupture and collapse within his perfectly designed body. There is only incredibly dense, resilient muscle and flexible cartilage slowly, evenly compressing under the crushing, unimaginable weight of 4,000 meters of dark salt water. When the colossal, lifeless carcass finally impacts the soft, gray, silty sediment of the abyssal plain, it does not shatter. It lands with a massive, silent thud, sending a slow-motion, billowing cloud of ancient, undisturbed marine snow rising into the pitch-black water. This impact immediately triggers a localized, magnificent biological explosion. In our modern timeline, marine biologists study these incredibly rare and vital events, knowing them as whale falls, massive concentrated oases of life-sustaining nutrients that briefly interrupt the otherwise desolate, starving, and freezing desert of the deep-sea floor. But in this alternative reality, characterized by a massive global population of giant sharks dominating the surface waters, the phenomenon is a Megalodon fall, an even more massive and biologically complex transfer of concentrated solar energy to the lightless depths. Almost immediately, the invisible, rich chemical scent of decomposing tissue is carried for hundreds of kilometers on the slow, creeping, freezing bottom currents. The very first responders to this silent alarm are the hagfish, incredibly primitive, jawless scavengers that have remained virtually unchanged by evolution for over 300 million years. These ancient creatures arrive out of the darkness in writhing, blind swarms numbering in the hundreds of thousands, boring directly into the decomposing flesh of the fallen giant to absorb the rich, complex proteins directly through their own specialized skin. Closely following them are the giant, pale, incredibly sluggish, deep-sea sleeper sharks. These ghostly giants survive in the freezing, lightless depths by moving with agonizing slowness to conserve their desperately low metabolic energy. Now, presented with an absolute bounty, they tear away massive, ragged chunks of the megalodon's muscle, their luminous, unblinking eyes reflecting the faint, sudden, bioluminescent flashes of disturbed, microscopic plankton. Colossal benthic crabs with spindly, armored legs spanning over 3 meters across step delicately and methodically over the massive serrated teeth that once effortlessly crushed the rib cages of giant whales. They pick at the scraps of flesh with meticulous mechanical precision, completely indifferent to the former terrifying majesty of the creature they are systematically dismantling. The deep sea is an absolute thermodynamic equalizer. It does not respect the hierarchy of the sunlit surface. When the soft tissues have been entirely consumed by the frantic, writhing masses of scavengers, a process that may take many years due to the sheer, incomprehensible mass of the fallen 85-ton giant, the secondary, highly specialized stage of the benthic ecosystem begins. Microscopic, drifting larvae of highly adapted bone-eating worms, known to human biological science as osedacs, settle gently upon the dense, heavily mineralized cartilage of the shark's immense skeleton. Unlike the massive marine mammals of our timeline, which possess calcified, highly porous bones rich with internal lipid reserves, the Megalodon leaves behind a slightly different skeletal matrix. This requires unique, highly specialized symbiotic bacteria living within the root systems of the worms to secrete powerful acids, breaking down and digesting the dense cartilaginous structures. Over decades, these delicate crimson-plumed worms slowly, methodically dissolve the massive towering vertebrae and the terrifying crescent-shaped jaws, completely erasing the final physical legacy of the apex predator and returning its constituent atoms directly back into the vast circulating chemistry of the global ocean. There is absolutely no concept of waste in this perfect, meticulously balanced alternative world. There are no massive stone monuments built to desperately defy the relentless ravages of time, no elaborate chemical attempts to preserve the dead physical form against the inevitable, unforgiving physics of entropy and decay. The uniquely human obsession with leaving a permanent legacy, the deep, agonizing and uniquely conscious fear of being entirely forgotten by the universe, is merely a symptom of a primate mind that has become tragically disconnected from the fundamental reality of ecological recycling. The giant shark does not mourn the loss of its individual identity. It willingly, beautifully surrenders its 85 tons of collected biological energy back to the dark, freezing abyss, actively feeding tens of thousands of other organisms in a magnificent, silent act of ultimate utility. As you lie perfectly still, preparing your own body for the quiet oblivion of sleep, allow the heavy, sinking gravity of this beautiful concept to pull you down into a state of profound, undisturbed rest. Let the stressful, exhausting anxieties of your own personal legacy completely dissolve into the vast recycling currents of the deep ocean. You are not required to leave a permanent mark upon the world. You are simply a temporary, beautiful expression of energy. And when your time comes to rest, the universe will gently, flawlessly, and completely reclaim you, asking for nothing in return. 400,000 years ago, the luminous sphere of the Earth continued its majestic orbital dance around a slowly burning yellow dwarf star, drifting silently through the freezing vacuum of the Milky Way. In the timeline we defensively claim as our own, this specific astronomical period was characterized by the relentless advance and retreat of the crushing Pleistocene ice sheets, a brutal rhythm dictated entirely by the subtle mathematical variations in the planet's axial tilt and orbital eccentricity, phenomena known as Milankovitch cycles. These slow astronomical wobbles altered the solar radiation reaching the atmosphere, and because our fragile continents blocked the vital equatorial ocean currents, these tiny fluctuations triggered devastating global freezing events. But in the alternative, magnificent reality we inhabit tonight, The Earth was profoundly insulated against these perturbations, because the Isthmus of Panama remained a fractured, highly porous archipelago. The global ocean acted as a perfect thermal buffer. The uninterrupted equatorial current continuously circulated millions of cubic kilometers of solar-heated water around the entire globe, completely overriding the cooling effects of the orbital wobbles. The planet remained locked in its sweltering, stable Pliocene equilibrium. However, this climatic stability did not equate to a world without violence. The tremendous, unrelenting accumulation of thermal energy within the tropical surface waters had to be periodically and violently discharged, resulting in atmospheric phenomena of a ferocity that completely defies human comprehension. In our modern oceans, a surface water temperature of 26 degrees Celsius is the minimum required threshold to ignite the thermodynamic engine of a tropical cyclone. In this alternative, hyperheated world, massive unbroken stretches of the global ocean consistently maintain surface temperatures exceeding 32 degrees Celsius. This vast reservoir of latent heat fueled the creation of hypercyclones, atmospheric apex predators that dwarfed the most destructive hurricanes ever recorded in human history. Imagine a storm system sprawling across 2,000 kilometers of open, borderless ocean, possessing a central barometric pressure so terrifyingly low that it caused the physical surface of the sea to bulge upward in a localized dome. The eye wall of this hypercyclone towered nearly 20 kilometers into the stratosphere, an impenetrable cylinder of dark cumulonimbus generating continuous blinding sheets of electrical discharge. The sustained surface winds screamed with a deafening physical force, exceeding 350 kilometers per hour, tearing the crests off massive rogue waves that swelled to heights of 30 meters before collapsing violently upon themselves in a chaotic, churning explosion of pulverized salt water. This was not merely a weather event. It was a planetary pressure valve, a terrifying mechanism for transferring unimaginable volumes of excess solar heat from the boiling equatorial ocean directly into the freezing upper atmosphere. Beneath the terrifying blackened sky and the churning surface of the Caribbean Sea, the intricate sun-drenched paradise of the Great Pan-American Reef faced an event of catastrophic physical destruction. The massive 30-meter storm surges and the colossal wave action penetrated deep into the shallow coastal waters, violently ripping ancient towering coral heads from their limestone foundations and pulverizing the delicate structures into fine white sand. The vibrant nurseries that provided absolute sanctuary for the young, inexperienced megalodons were suddenly transformed into lethal washing machines of swirling debris and crushing hydrodynamic pressure. For the juvenile sharks, weighing merely a few hundred kilograms, the hypercyclone was an absolute merciless executioner. Countless numbers were violently thrown against the jagged limestone structures, their flexible skeletons shattered by the overwhelming kinetic force of the churning water. But for the massive, fully mature adults patrolling the deeper pelagic edges of the continental shelf, the approaching storm was not a sudden surprise. They possessed a sensory warning system far more advanced and exquisitely sensitive than the most sophisticated meteorological satellites ever launched by human engineers. Nearly 3 days before the blackened, towering clouds of the hypercyclone appeared on the distant horizon, a massive 70-ton female megalodon registered the invisible, approaching atmospheric anomaly. Deep within her complex inner ear, specialized maculae containing tiny, dense calcium carbonate crystals detected the minute, almost imperceptible drop in the ambient barometric pressure, a signal transmitted instantaneously through the heavy fluid of the ocean. Simultaneously, her extensive lateral line system, running the entire length of her colossal flanks, began to pick up the deep resonant subsonic frequencies generated by the massive waves hundreds of kilometers away. This incredibly low-frequency infrasound traveled significantly faster through the dense water than the storm itself moved across the surface. She did not require a complex analytical brain to interpret these subtle signals. She did not experience a moment of anxious existential dread or panic about the impending destruction of her immediate environment. Her response was a masterpiece of pure, unthinking evolutionary programming, refined through tens of millions of years of enduring similar catastrophic atmospheric events. With a slow, deliberate, and immensely powerful sweep of her colossal crescent-shaped tail fin, she turned her massive, sensory-rich snout away from the turbulent, shallow reef drop-off and oriented herself toward the dark, infinite expanse of the open abyssal plain. She adjusted the precise angle of her 6-meter-wide pectoral fins and initiated a steep, incredibly efficient descent. As she dropped through the water column, leaving the warm, oxygen-rich epipelagic zone behind, the chaotic, deafening roar of the surface turbulence rapidly faded into a muffled, distant hum. She sank effortlessly past 100 meters, then 200 meters, allowing the immense, crushing hydrostatic pressure to gently compress her massive oil-filled liver, neutralizing her buoyancy perfectly. By the time the terrifying, screaming fury of the hypercyclone passed directly overhead, tearing the surface of the ocean apart with 350 km/h winds, the giant shark was suspended perfectly motionless at a depth of 400 meters. Down here, in the cold, silent indigo twilight, the water was completely undisturbed. She hovered in absolute magnificent tranquility, a 70-ton shadow suspended in the void, patiently waiting out the atmospheric violence occurring half a kilometer above her massive dorsal fin. She would remain in this dark, silent sanctuary for several days, her metabolism slowed, her heart beating perhaps only 2 or 3 times a minute, conserving her vast energy reserves until the subtle mathematical changes in pressure and infrasound signaled that the sky had cleared and the surface was once again safe to reclaim. There is a profound, incredibly beautiful philosophical lesson hidden within the giant shark's instinctual response to absolute, overwhelming chaos. As human beings, trapped within our uniquely anxious minds, we possess a desperate, exhausting compulsion to constantly fight against the unpredictable storms of our own lives. We build massive walls to protect ourselves from inevitable change. We suffer intensely from the illusion that we must always remain in absolute control of our external circumstances. When the chaotic forces of reality inevitably threaten to overwhelm our carefully constructed plans, we panic and exhaust ourselves, fighting against currents infinitely more powerful than we could comprehend. But the Megalodon does not waste a single joule of energy attempting to fight the hypercyclone. It does not rage against the darkening sky or mourn the temporary destruction of its hunting grounds. It simply recognizes the overwhelming force of the environment, accepts its physical limitations, and elegantly retreats into the calm stillness that always exists beneath the chaotic surface. As you lie here, imagine possessing the same ability to effortlessly descend beneath the violent turbulence of your daily existence. The anxieties, the deadlines, and the endless demands of the modern world are exactly like the screaming winds of that storm. They demand your panicked attention, but they only exist on the very surface of your consciousness. You do not need to fight them or desperately struggle to control the wind. You only need to let go of your rigid resistance, Adjust the metaphorical angle of your fins and allow yourself to slowly, gracefully sink down into the deep, infinitely peaceful core of your own being. Down here, far beneath the noisy surface of your life, there is a place of undisturbed tranquility. It is dark, quiet, and entirely safe from the storm. The external world can rage, the winds can howl, and the waves can crash. But you are suspended perfectly in the silent, comforting gravity of the present moment. The giant shark has waited out thousands of storms in this exact manner, secure in the ancient knowledge that every cyclone inevitably passes and the golden sun always returns. Allow yourself to rest in that deep, unshakable sanctuary. The storm above does not matter. The ocean below is vast, and you are perfectly safe in the silent dark. 150 years ago, in the timeline that we defensively claim as the only valid historical reality, a fragile, deeply anxious bipedal ape learned to extract subterranean reservoirs of fossilized carbon and ignite them, initiating a frantic era of mechanical industrialization. This uncontrolled mastery of combustion filled the delicate atmosphere with suffocating layers of carbon dioxide, fundamentally altering the ancient chemical balance of the global ocean. In our timeline, the seas absorbed this anthropogenic carbon pulse, increasing in acidity, systematically dissolving the calcium carbonate shells of microscopic plankton, and initiating the cascading collapse of the magnificent coral reef ecosystems. The sprawling surface of the ocean was violently disrupted by the deafening roar of steel-hulled cargo vessels, polluting the acoustic environment with the disorienting grind of massive propellers that shattered the complex songs of the great whales. But in the alternative, perfectly balanced reality we are exploring tonight, there are no concrete smokestacks piercing the horizon, pouring toxic clouds into the azure sky. There are no invisible nets scraping the ocean floor, indiscriminately stripping the abyssal plains of life. The earth remains a completely untamed, silent blue sphere, its complex chemical equilibrium fiercely guarded by the unbroken laws of biological thermodynamics and the undisputed reign of the giant shark. To truly appreciate the unassailable dominance of Autodus Megalodon, we must briefly divert our attention from the heavily muscled apex of the food web and examine the microscopic, entirely invisible foundation upon which this colossal oceanic empire rests. Far out in the deep pelagic expanse of the Pacific Basin, millions of square kilometers of dark open water are suddenly transformed into a swirling, luminous soup of staggering biological density. Because the Isthmus of Panama remained a fractured, porous volcanic archipelago, the freezing, nutrient-dense waters from the bottom of the ocean floor are periodically driven toward the surface by the immense power of the equatorial current, striking the submerged volcanic ridges. This massive vertical upwelling delivers thousands of tons of essential silicates, life-giving nitrates, and dissolved iron directly into the warm, sun-drenched epipelagic zone. Almost instantaneously, billions upon trillions of microscopic phytoplankton respond to this sudden influx of raw chemical energy. They reproduce exponentially in a blindingly green biological explosion that is so incredibly vast it could easily be observed from the upper atmosphere. These single-celled organisms, drifting aimlessly in the gentle currents, are the undeniable engines of this alternative world, capturing the raw energy of the local star through the silent miracle of photosynthesis, and converting it directly into the foundational biological fuel that ultimately sustains every terrifying creature in the boundless global ocean. This microscopic bloom instantly triggers a sudden, violent, and incredibly beautiful trophic cascade, a frantic celebration of pure caloric energy. Massive swarms of tiny translucent krill and small, highly coordinated schooling bait fish, numbering in the hundreds of billions, arrive to aggressively harvest the sprawling phytoplankton meadows, transforming the calm surface water into a chaotic, shimmering maelstrom of desperate consumption. They are followed almost immediately by dense schools of much larger predatory fish, darting through the chaotic water column with blinding silver flashes of biological lightning. Then, rising from the darker, cooler indigo depths like magnificent silent submarines, come the cetaceans. Because the oceans of this alternative reality never froze, and therefore never forced the desperate evolution of the massive, highly migratory blue whales, this spectacular feast is enthusiastically attended by hundreds of smaller, highly localized baleen whales. Their intricately pleated throats expand massively as they lunge aggressively through the dense concentrations of krill, filtering millions of calories from the seawater in a single, devastatingly efficient gulp. The surface of the ocean becomes a boiling, chaotic frenzy of desperate survival and ravenous, unthinking consumption. And hovering quietly on the dark indigo periphery of this massive biological congregation, watching the chaos with cold, mathematically precise calculations, is the absolute master of the realm. A fully mature, heavily scarred female megalodon, spanning an awe-inspiring 21 meters in total length and weighing an incomprehensible 75 tons, senses the immense overlapping bioelectric signatures of the feeding frenzy from dozens of kilometers away. She does not rush. She does not exhibit the frantic, desperate energy of the smaller predators that must aggressively consume thousands of tiny organisms just to survive. She is a creature of absolute, majestic patience, the ultimate culmination of this vast oceanic energy transfer. She perfectly utilizes her massive oil-filled liver to achieve a state of flawless hovering neutrality, slowly and deliberately advancing through the dense water column with sweeping strokes of her colossal, crescent-shaped tail. As she silently enters the periphery of the massive feeding event, the sheer magnitude of her physical presence instantly alters the behavior of every other creature. The smaller predatory fish scatter in absolute, blind panic. The baleen whales, completely absorbed in their ravenous consumption just moments before, suddenly register the terrifying acoustic pressure wave of her approach and desperately attempt to flee into the protective depths. But the giant shark has already targeted a specific, slightly slower individual, a 7-meter cetathur that has consumed far too much dense krill to maneuver with its usual evasive agility. The execution is instantaneous, incredibly brutal, and flawlessly executed. A sudden burst of kinetic energy culminating in a massive bite of 110,000 newtons that instantly shatters the whale's spine, extinguishing its life before its primitive brain can even register the terrifying shadow of its executioner. In our profoundly anxious, hyper-intellectual, human-dominated reality, we desperately attempt to separate ourselves from this brutal, beautiful, and inescapable web of biological consumption. We arrogantly place ourselves completely outside of the natural order, constructing massive sterilized supermarkets and climate-controlled cities to hide from the inescapable truth that all living things must ultimately feed upon other living things. We are absolutely terrified of our own inherent physical vulnerability, constantly fighting a losing battle against the inevitable cycle of decay, entropy, and physical dissolution. But in the alternative, magnificent reality of the eternal Pliocene ocean, there is absolutely no separation, no delusion, and no fear. The giant shark, despite its terrifying size and its absolute dominance over the entire global ecosystem, is intimately, flawlessly connected to the microscopic phytoplankton drifting aimlessly in the sunlit currents. If the microscopic foundation were to suddenly collapse, the towering apex would inevitably and quickly starve. The megalodon is not a cruel monster arbitrarily punishing the weaker creatures of the sea. It is simply a vital, perfectly functioning organ within the massive breathing body of the global ocean. It enforces the brutal, completely necessary equilibrium that prevents any single species from endlessly multiplying and destroying the entire environment. It is the necessary, sharp, unfeeling edge of the ecological balance, ensuring the continuous, unbroken health of the entire interconnected planetary system. There is a profound, incredibly liberating, and deeply relaxing peace to be discovered in this philosophical realization of absolute interconnectedness. You, as a human being lying quietly in the dark, preparing your mind and body for sleep, are entirely constructed from the exact same ancient, recycled atoms that form the microscopic phytoplankton, the massive baleen whales, and the terrifying, heavily muscled jaws of the giant shark. You are not a lonely, isolated entity forced to desperately fight against a cold, indifferent universe. You are an integral, beautiful, and incredibly fleeting manifestation of the magnificent cosmos itself. The universe is not something external that aggressively happens to you. The universe is exactly what you are. Allow the heavy, exhausting burden of your own individual ego, with all its petty demands and endless fears, to gently, slowly dissolve into this vast, comforting ocean of interconnected biological energy. Let go entirely of the desperate, anxious illusion that you must somehow aggressively control the massive, chaotic currents of your own life. The ocean is infinitely larger than you, and its ancient currents are incredibly strong, but they are not malicious. They are simply moving, exactly as they have moved for tens of millions of years. Imagine yourself sinking slowly, safely, and comfortably into that massive interconnected web of life. You do not need to fight, you do not need to struggle, and you do not need to anxiously justify your own existence. You are perfectly supported by the heavy, warm, and entirely indifferent salt water of the cosmos. As your breathing slows and deepens, matching the ancient rhythmic pulse of the tides, let the quiet, dreamless darkness of the deep ocean wash over you, pulling you gently down into the ultimate, peaceful sanctuary of undisturbed rest. Here is a strange and deeply unsettling thought to sit with as you lie in the quiet darkness of your room. If you are currently listening to the sound of my voice, if your complex, highly evolved auditory cortex is translating these acoustic vibrations into meaningful language, and if your anxious, endlessly inquisitive mind is capable of comprehending the staggering implications of this entirely speculative narrative, then the Isthmus of Panama absolutely closed. The ancient, life-giving equatorial currents were undeniably severed. The devastating planetary ice ages of the Pleistocene epoch descended upon the Earth with terrifying, freezing finality. And the most magnificent, perfectly engineered apex predator to ever patrol the global oceans, Autodus Megalodon, undeniably and tragically starved to death in a rapidly freezing, dying world. That is the inescapable, brutal paradox resting at the very heart of this entire nocturnal thought experiment. The very act of imagining a perfect, unbroken world where the giant shark eternally survived requires a deeply anxious, highly advanced, and incredibly fragile human mind capable of complex, abstract imagination. And that specific, uniquely human mind, your mind, with all of its profound capacity for wonder, existential terror, and technological mastery, exists exclusively because the eternal, warm, magnificent world of the giant shark shattered into a million frozen pieces. Human intelligence, the very consciousness that arrogantly considers itself the ultimate pinnacle of the evolutionary process, is not some predetermined, inevitable endpoint that the biological universe was patiently striving to achieve. It is a wildly improbable contingency, a bizarre, unprecedented cosmic accident, the highly unlikely result of a very specific, chaotic sequence of geological and climatological disasters that began when tectonic plates collided millions of years ago, fundamentally altering the thermal dynamics of the planet. If those tectonic plates had merely ground against one another without fully fusing into an impenetrable continental wall, there would be absolutely no one here to wonder what might have been. The massive climatic shift that drained the sun-drenched coastal nurseries of the giant shark is exactly what ultimately created us. As the global oceans cooled and ice caps locked away millions of cubic kilometers of water, atmospheric circulation shifted violently. The lush, unbroken jungles blanketing the African continent began to inexorably wither, replaced by vast, unforgiving, seasonal open savannas. Our tiny, tree-dwelling primate ancestors were violently evicted from their ancestral home, unceremoniously forced down onto the hard, predator-rich grasslands. To survive this terrifying new environment, they were subjected to uncompromising selective pressures, favoring bipedal locomotion, the frantic development of cooperative social structures, the invention of primitive stone tools, and the rapid, metabolically expensive expansion of the cerebral cortex. Our brains grew large precisely because the world became profoundly difficult and endlessly unpredictable. Every step of that terrifying evolutionary journey was deeply contingent. If the climate had never dried out, if our ancestors had adapted without requiring an immense brain, the specific spark of human consciousness would simply never have been struck. In the magnificent alternative timeline we've been exploring throughout this documentary, absolutely none of those necessary chaotic contingencies would have ever played out. The African savanna would have never materialized to forge the human mind, and the Earth would have continued its silent rotation through the vast, dark cosmos completely devoid of our anxious, restless, and endlessly destructive presence. Let us project this alternative reality forward to the exact present moment, the year 2026. Stand upon a virtual imaginary cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean in this alternative present-day world. The fundamental geography is vaguely familiar. The grand tectonic outlines of the continents remain essentially the same, as the grinding drift of the continental plates operates on timescales so vast that a mere 3 million years is not sufficient to radically rearrange the planetary map. However, the world you are observing is terrifyingly wild, utterly pristine, and completely unblemished in a way that our own modern Earth has not experienced for tens of thousands of years. There are absolutely no massive steel-hulled cargo ships dragging heavy, destructive nets across the fragile abyssal plains. There are no invisible, deafening shock waves of military sonar desperately echoing through the deep water column, disorienting and torturing the marine mammals. There are no sprawling coastal metropolises pouring millions of tons of toxic synthetic chemicals and suffocating plastic waste into the fragile coastal estuaries. The atmosphere is completely clear, devoid of the choking, invisible blanket of anthropogenic carbon dioxide. The global climate remains fiercely and beautifully dictated solely by the slow, mathematical rhythm of orbital mechanics and the occasional spectacular violence of natural volcanic eruptions. The global ocean of this alternative 2026 is a masterpiece of stabilized, unbroken biological hierarchy. The Great Pan-American Reef, unbothered by the catastrophic bleaching events caused by rapid, human-induced oceanic warming and acidification, stretches continuously for thousands of kilometers, a staggering, three-dimensional limestone metropolis teeming with an unimaginable diversity of vibrant tropical life. The shallow waters are thick with massive, slow-moving sirenians and heavily armored marine reptiles that look entirely alien to our modern sensibilities. And patrolling the deep indigo edges of this endless continental shelf are the absolute masters of the realm, the direct, unbroken descendants of the giant sharks we have tracked through deep geological time. They have not evolved into something fundamentally new, because perfection requires no further alteration. A massive 70-ton female megalodon glides silently through the crystal-clear water, her slate-gray flanks bearing the deep white scars of a century of absolute, terrifying dominance. She shares this boundless, borderless blue expanse with the magnificent pack-hunting raptorial sperm whales, maintaining a brutal, necessary, and perfectly balanced ecological partition that has lasted for over 20 million years. The skies above this ancient churning sea are filled with massive soaring seabirds, their wings catching the powerful invisible thermal updrafts generated by the boiling equatorial sun. It is a world of staggering, breathtaking beauty, of incomprehensible biological complexity, of endless, desperate struggle and improbable, magnificent persistence, all playing out on a grand planetary stage that has remained fundamentally unchanged since the fading warmth of the Pliocene epoch. And the most profound, deeply unsettling truth about this beautiful, terrifying world is that it absolutely does not need us. It does not require a conscious human observer to document its majesty, to assign it a philosophical meaning, or to validate its existence through art, poetry, or scientific measurement. It simply is. It exists with the same absolute, unshakable certainty as the cold, silent rocks of the moon or the burning nuclear furnace of the sun. We possess a natural psychological tendency to assume consciousness is the ultimate goal of the evolutionary process. We want to believe the history of the expanding universe was orchestrated specifically to produce a mind capable of understanding it. But the unyielding mechanics of the natural world suggest otherwise. Evolution does not possess a narrative goal or a moral compass. It is simply a blind process of physical variation and environmental selection. The giant shark was not a primitive failure because it never developed the capacity to build a telescope or experience the crushing weight of existential dread. It was a spectacular, unprecedented success precisely because it dominated the largest environment on the planet for an incomprehensible span of geological time, sustaining the interconnected web of life without ever wondering why. There is a profound, comforting serenity in acknowledging the meaningless, beautiful reality of that existence. It is a world entirely free from the exhausting human burden of constant justification. As the quiet darkness settles softly around your fragile body, allow the comforting weight of this realization to pull you gently toward sleep. The continents shifted, the ice ages came, the giant sharks died, and here you are, millions of years later, lying safely in bed, listening to a story about a magnificent world that never was. But as you close your eyes and surrender your active consciousness to the necessity of rest, imagine that alternative reality. The warm darkness of the ancient Pliocene night, the eternal crashing of waves against the limestone reef, the exact same cold, distant stars wheeling silently overhead, casting their faint light upon a world that completely ignores them. In that deep, silent ocean, something unimaginably vast is resting. A colossal, perfect creature is suspended effortlessly in the dark water, its massive eyes closing, its powerful heartbeat slowing, its ancient mind dimming beautifully toward absolute rest. Two vastly different worlds, two entirely separate timelines, but the exact same heavy, comforting night is falling softly over both of them. The giant shark never asked why it existed. It never lay awake terrified of the future. It simply lived, it simply swam, and now, just like you, it simply rests in the quiet, eternal dark.